Chapter 2. Boiling Anger.
Captain Newton entrusted his prodigal son to his old friend Menesti. The ship is going to leave after the Christmas break. There will be plenty of time to prepare. The son and father had a special time for the next 2 weeks. Around that time, she received a letter from Abigail asking her to visit. While praying one day, Abigail had an idea that the story she had shared with Elizabeth long ago about marrying John and her daughter Polly could come true. On the way back from running errands for his father in Kent, John remembered the letter. He asked for directions and rode the horse to the cutlet on his chest. Abigail could see the features of Elizabeth in his handsome face. Abigail had tears in her eyes. Abigail and her husband liked John's friendly demeanor and good manners. Polly fell in love with John's story. She felt her mouth go dry suddenly as her heart beat strangely when she smiled. When he watches her, she too lowers her head, her face blushing. They invited John to spend Christmas with them. Love feelings grew between the two. As they walked along the trail, John kissed her on the lips as she looked up at him. Polly's heart beat quickened. She had never kissed anyone before, so she was excited and quite different. John did not say what awaited him in London. Menesti was probably making final preparations to head for Jamaica. Looking back on the past few days, however, John couldn't imagine leaving for Jamaica, where she would spend the next 5 years without seeing Polly. She was determined not to set sail with Menesti. Menesti waited as long as possible, but eventually sailed away, and John's father, in a fit of rage, decided to give up his son. In any case, at 18, you are old enough to be independent on your own. Returning home, John pondered his situation. The thing I didn't want to do the most in the world was to go to sea on a merchant ship. Especially now that he was in love with Polly. But he regretted having offended his father. John went to the port of London to find work and became a third mate. When the ship departed, the hard work continued, and there was no end to the busy work day and night. There was no time for her to even think about her except to meet her Polly in her dreams. Whenever she thought of John or Polly, she decided to live a more moral life from now on, but that never lasted. During her voyage he had several times in various port cities where he cast aside his morals like a mate, despite his resolve to do so. When she docked in Spain, she even gave up her virginity to her prostitute. Exactly 1 year later, John's ship docked in London Harbour. During the days at home, John was restless. It had been almost a year since I had seen Polly. John swore to keep her promise this time, and managed to get permission from her father to visit the Catlets. John walked through the snowy fields and woods, chatting with Polly. John felt guilty towards Polly as the memories of her with her prostitute weighed heavily on her mind. She was confident that if she wanted to, he could seduce her and have sexual relations with her before she left, but she vowed not to. John indulged in the pleasure of being with Polly, and stayed 1 more week from the departure date. Back in London, the ship had already left, and my father was furious again. Captain Newton looked for another ship for his son, but to no avail. For weeks, the two tried everything possible, but nothing came of it. One day John was on his way to Chesham to see Polly once more, if only briefly, when he came across a group of conscripts in an ambush waiting for men to be drafted for the war between England and France. They beat people with sticks and pushed them roughly through the door of a small barn. At dawn, they were tagged and taken aboard the British battleship Howitz, which was moored in the harbour. Those who were once drafted into the army were hanged as deserters the day they were caught trying to escape. John Newton, who became an apprentice after his prisoner's cell, was enjoying his new environment before he knew it. He got some authority too. But he forgot how exploited and miserable he had been when he was a common sailor, and became one of the very exploiters. People couldn't understand John's sudden change. Before long, everyone on the crew was trying to avoid John if possible. But strangely, John couldn't get close to the captain, or the other officers either. He was rebellious, unopened, and confined to himself. In April and May, the Hawichi was on escort missions in the North Sea. Around this time, one of the apprentices had noticed John's tastes, and was trying to get closer to him. A man named James Mitchell approached John one night, while he was off duty, and saw him reading. John was overjoyed to have an intellectual conversation with Mitchell after a long time. Said Mitchell, "Life would be much simpler and more enjoyable if the tension between pleasure and conscience were removed. If you get rid of the conscience, there is no sin. If there is no sin, what need is God to point it out? Think about it, John. Do you think obeying God will make you happier or more successful? A mature man does what he thinks is right. What is there to be afraid of? Then what about death?" John questioned. "What are you afraid of? Death is just the cessation of life. There is no judgment day or hellfire. It just doesn't exist." These words from Mitchell fascinated John greatly. One evening Mitchell and John were standing in the stern of the boat, watching the moonlight. John hated his own indecision. He had to deal with these things before he could enjoy complete freedom. With his mother's teachings on sin and redemption, John threw his deeply entrenched conscience into the Black Sea. After that, John spent several days and nights with Mitchell, becoming more and more absorbed in his philosophy. The pious faith of Job Lewis, a young apprentice, also became a toy for them. In less than half of the 60 days, John made Job throw away his religious beliefs. John persuaded Job to get drunk with rum in a waterfront tavern with them, and then to sleep with a prostitute on the second floor, telling the guilty Job, "You are enlightened now, Job. Now you have the freedom to live the life you want." That is intellectual freedom. In the summer of 1744, escort duty on the Hawichi was very tedious for the crew. All sailors were allowed about 12 hours of vacation. But when the vessel docked within sight of Polly's house in Kesham, John's heart was gloomy. Although she was right next to her, somehow her heart was heavy. After Polly's father found out that John had been on Kesham twice, and had given up important embarkations to him, he wrote to tell him that he had no choice but to reconsider marrying his daughter to such an untrustworthy man. She went to John Polly's house to ask for forgiveness, but Mr. Catlett was adamant. In September, Harwich engaged the French battleship Solide in a close encounter, inflicting heavy casualties and damage on her opponent and capturing her battleship. The British Royal Navy paid £5 for each captured Solide. John had planned to visit Catlett Street while the ship was docking at Kesem, but the plan was cancelled because the anchorage had changed, and now he had to embark on a 5-year journey around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa to the Far East. It was done. John pondered the situation, and finally went to Captain Carteret, and managed to get permission to go out for 12 hours. However, after more than 12 hours of delay, he was recaptured by sailors who were looking for deserters, and was forcibly taken along with others tagged as deserters. John fell to his knees on the floor with a thud, when he heard the sentence of flogging 100 times with the cat's 9 tails. No one survived the beating. It was a punishment that had an iron attached to the end of its tail, which penetrated the skin and inflicted wounds to the bones. The drums sounded and the beating began. It was clear that the boatswain was taking satisfaction in beating John, since he had always been on bad terms with him. When he was hit with his 24th stroke, John passed out. It took more than a month for John's wound to heal. When he returned to service, he felt like a leper. Everyone avoided him. They seemed to avenge the humiliation they had received from John. Even his friends, James Mitchell and Job Lewis, didn't come close. After several tedious months of quelling his simmering resentment against Captain Carteret, John was released from the draft in a series of unforeseen events. He was traded for a crew member on a merchant ship called the Pegasus, where life was more comfortable than before. The captain also seemed friendly. This merchant ship was a slave ship. He traveled mainly along the west coast of Africa, exchanging goods for slaves. Screams of pain pierced the air as each slave was graded. John smelled the red-hot, iron-burning flesh that would leave indelible scars on a slave's shoulder or arm. As the sailors smoked cigarettes and sang quiet songs as they enjoyed their evening, John could hear the howls coming from the lower compartment of the ship behind this peaceful scene.